Hello, my name is Paul Hart. We're here with the Missoula Area Partners for the Disabled. Our topic tonight is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed into law by President Bush in July of 1990. The purpose of the act was to prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability. It covers such areas as employment, public services, public transportation, and public accommodations. We have two guests with us tonight, Mike Regner, who is from the Summit Independent Living Center, and Jim Marks, who's coordinator for the Disability Services with the University of Montana. We have a lot of topics to cover tonight, so let's get started. To begin with, how many people with disabilities are there in the United States? Jim?
Congress said 43 million when they were looking at ADA to begin with. That was the figure that they used. It's roughly 17% of the American population.
And how about the local area? And Mike, you can talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, we don't, unfortunately, we don't have real good data about Montana and the Missoula area in general, but if we kind of extrapolate from the national statistics, we'd probably say there are about 136,000 or more in the state, and probably 8,500 or more in Missoula. And we found from the national data that, that rural areas tend to be overrepresented in terms of people with disabilities. So we're probably looking at a larger number than those percentages would indicate.
Can you give us some background about the Americans with Disabilities Act? For instance, where did the law come from?
Well, it didn't just come out of nowhere, and we really have a lot of history to talk about in terms of the way people with disabilities have been treated. Jim is aware of this, the kinds of things that we're talking about, where people with disabilities were, originally left to die in nomad, wandering type tribes, and as society progressed and evolved, people with disabilities were looked upon as unclean, and that disability was a manifestation of sin or evil. That kind of progressed to somewhat of a service-oriented attitude toward people with disabilities, where people were isolated and segregated and institutionalized and still thought about as being inferior, and really just didn't have any kind of opportunities for any kind of equal treatment. So that's sort of the context in which these kinds of legislation sort of arose.
I've heard the ADA referred to as a civil rights bill. Jim, how would you relate this bill to civil rights?
Well, it's basically giving us protection under the law to be able to get into mainstream American life. So what it does is it gives us that protection that we need, that legal recourse in the event we do encounter discrimination, which is exactly what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does, exactly what other recent civil rights legislation does.
Usually we think of discrimination as racism, ageism, sexism, but how does discrimination apply to people with disabilities?
To kind of add on to a little bit about what Jim was talking about, this law is really based on the Civil Rights Act, and a forerunner of the Americans with Disabilities Act is another law called Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and that law was the first law, the first federal law that actually acknowledged that denial of participation in and of itself constituted discrimination. And we're used to thinking of it in terms of kind of overt denial, where people are said, we don't allow minorities to work here, or we don't want women to work here, and those kinds of things. And truly we see that with people with disabilities too, overt kinds of denial. But more often what we see is a failure to make any kind of reasonable accommodation for disability, which would allow a person with a disability to actually participate equally and have equality of opportunity. And so that it kind of requires a shift of thinking when we think of discrimination as an act that someone does. When you do it with reference to a person with a disability, that also includes the failure to take action to accommodate a disability.
Well, how is a disability defined according to this act?
Jim?
Maybe I could, it's going to use, I think, the Section 504 guidelines. And I know Section 504 quite well because of recent events at the University of Montana, where several grievances were filed through the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education against the university. And one of the things that they look at it, first of all, is what constitutes a disability. And pretty much what it is any kind of loss of a major life function like walking or talking or seeing or hearing. And then it can be a disability that has a cosmetic effect, may not have any effect functionally, like a disfigurement that may prevent you from getting a position, some kind of a job or accessing some kind of a club. And then also to be considered disabled, a recent one is the attention deficit disorder, which wasn't considered a disability until fairly recently by the Department of Education.
The Act covers employment too, and I guess that's one of the main sections or titles in the Act. Mike, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the major provisions of this title.
Okay. I guess just to kind of give a little bit of an overview of it, the Act is divided into 5 titles. And Title I is employment. Title II covers the activities of state and local government and public transportation. Title III covers public accommodations. Title IV covers telecommunications. And Title V is basically some miscellaneous provisions, some sort of housekeeping details and things that apply to all sections of the Act. But they all use the same definition of disability, that 3-prong definition that Jim mentioned, having the physical or mental impairment with a loss of major life activity, having a record of that impairment, or being misclassified as having an impairment, or being regarded as having an impairment, whether or not you actually do. And so that's the basis of who is covered under Title I of the employment section. And then the flip side of who is covered is obviously the employer. And as defined by the ADA, that includes an employer, an employment agency, a labor organization, or a joint labor management committee. There are a couple of exceptions, for instance, American Indian tribes and bona fide private membership clubs, or a corporation wholly owned by the United States government. And an employee just means a person employed, an individual with a disability employed by the employer. The general non-discrimination prohibitions under Title I apply to recruitment and hiring, pretty much all aspects of the job application process, as well as promotion, transfer, any kinds of benefits, rates of pay, job assignments, job classifications, fringe benefits, and it essentially just says that, thou shalt not treat people differentially in those terms. It also prohibits limiting or segregating people with disabilities, either directly or through contractual arrangements, or any of those kinds of things. And also, it's illegal to use any kind of standards or criteria or methods of administration that are not what's called job-related and consistent with business necessity in terms of discriminating against people with disabilities. So that's kind of the sort of overview, and there are a number of other kinds of provisions that factor in as well.
Sounds pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, it really is.
Now, if I were an employer, Jim, would I be required to hire a person just because that person has a disability?
No. I think a key phrase here is that an individual has to be otherwise qualified. So we're looking at no absolute preference, or no preference really of any kind. It's simply protection, so that if a person is qualified, that you can't exclude a person from employment solely on the basis of disability when they're otherwise qualified.
Now, when does this section of law go into effect?
You know the dates, Jim?
July 1, is it? I don't know.
July, you see 26 a lot in this date, and that's because it was signed on July 26, 1990. So the provisions of this title kick in for employers of 25 or more employees, July 26, 1992, and then 2 years later in 1994 for businesses with 15 to 25 employees. So ADA doesn't cover any employer of less than 15 employees. But an important thing for us to remember here in Montana is that we have a state human rights law which in one aspect mirrors the ADA, and they take one term out of ADA called reasonable accommodation, and that essentially means providing an employee with whatever they need that's reasonable to provide for them in order to help them to deal with their disability and how it relates to their ability to perform the job. So reasonable accommodation is covered in Montana for an employer of one or more employee. Otherwise, the rest of the provisions are for employers of 15 or more.
I think we're hoping that the enforcement effort will be stronger coming from the federal end of things. Montana law is stronger, but I think the enforcement leaves a lot to be desired. It's kind of like, where's the beef?
Now, what part of the title of the Act does cover public accommodations? And Jim, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what is a public accommodation and what is required under the Act. And
Okay, and be sure to help me out here, Michael.
yeah, you
because,
guys could just kick in on that.
A public accommodation, I think, is any kind of public facility that is open to the public: restaurants, gas stations, hotels, motels, anything that public is open to public consumption, private or public owned. And I'll let Michael take it from there.
Yeah. Yeah, Jim's right. It covers, there's something like 12 different categories, and it covers pretty much anything that you can think of. Restaurants and service establishments, banks, the dry cleaners, grocery stores, hotels, motels, places of recreation, like civic centers, movie theaters, all those kinds of things. And it also covers, there's another term called commercial facilities, and those are facilities that are not necessarily open to the public. For instance, maybe like a warehouse that would deal with distributors but doesn't do business directly with the public. And they have less responsibilities under the Act, but they're still covered under a number of the major provisions.
Now, how does Missoula stack up?
So-so. Parts of Missoula are better than others. Certainly the downtown area is probably a little worse, and that's pretty much the way it is for any city, because generally the downtown areas were built first. They're the oldest buildings, and they tend to have narrow doorways and stairs and no elevators, and they're built up as opposed to out. So we have lots of problems in the downtown area. But however, since we have no real consistent building code in terms of disability access, we do have some problems in the newer buildings that are being built too. Some are real good, and overall, we probably need some work.
How's the university doing in terms of the Act, Jim?
Well, the university is actually covered by Section 504. Section 504 is pretty much what ADA was built on, but 504 was limited to those entities that directly receive federal dollars, and the gun to the head of those recipients was the threat of the loss of federal funding. But there was no protection under in the private sector. The university has made vast improvements of late in services, but we are an old campus. We've got a long ways to go architecturally, but we are getting a new passenger elevator as a direct result of disability advocacy, and then the new School of Business building should be built to, we're hoping to kind of go beyond code to build an integrated, kind of a fully accessible building that doesn't look like a hospital or an institution. So.
Well, just thinking about people who run businesses now, I think a lot of them are probably concerned about what this is all going to cost and wondering who's going to pay for it. Who would cover the cost of these changes, and do business owners have to be concerned about going out of business?
That's a real good question, and that's the one that's probably on everyone's mind. And sort of to explain that, I need to just give you a couple of the main provisions in the Act. And in Title III under public accommodations, some of the general non-discriminatory language applies. You can't exclude or deny people access to a service or anything like that. But there are also some specific things that have to do with construction standards, and the strictest of which is for new construction and alterations or additions or remodeling, those kinds of things. And those are essentially just, there's no out. They're just required to be accessible, unless the accessibility cost would impose what's called an undue burden on the business. That essentially means significant difficulty or expense. However, that's the most stringent one. And what's actually required for existing businesses is that they do what's called barrier removal, which means in the statute and the regulations, they actually list like 21 different examples of things that are considered to be readily achievable, and that's another kind of key term in the law, and that means able to be accomplished without significant difficulty or expense. And it consists of things like maybe building a ramp, widening a doorway, putting up grab bars, rearranging a toilet stall, buying a TDD, installing flashing.
What's a TDD?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I use this jargon. I forget other people aren't familiar with it. It's a telecommunications device for the deaf, and that's one of those keyboards that people have probably seen where a deaf person types their message into a keyboard, and then it goes over the phone lines and is read on another TDD at the other end. So those kinds of things are considered to be readily achievable kinds of barrier removal. And the law essentially says that the business owner is responsible for those expenses to the extent that they don't impose an undue burden. And that's really a critical factor when we look at the ADA. It's a future-oriented law, and what it's saying is that we can't change our world overnight, and we don't expect that to happen. It's just not reasonable to think that that's doable. And so what we will do is we'll require that anything that's built in the future will be accessible when the costs are lowest, and it adds less than 1% to the overall cost. But in the meantime, we're gonna require people to do what they can that's easy and quick and not expensive to remove barriers so that people can have the opportunity to participate. But ADA isn't asking anyone to go out of business or anyone to suffer an undue hardship in order to make those accommodations. And if it comes to that, then the bottom line is that the business does not have to do it.
Now, what sort of funding is available to help businesses comply with the ADA?
Jim? Yeah.
Well, there's no funding. This is not a funded bill. It's probably why it got through a Republican president. But there's no funding for it whatsoever. It's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, but I think that there are some tax credits available, but there's no funding available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's unfortunate because we get that all the time. People call us and ask if there's a low-interest loan program or something available to help them make their business accessible. And, the bottom line is there's a program for a tax credit and a tax deduction, and there's also a tax deduction available for employers who hire people with disabilities. But aside from that, there's no direct assistance available.
Are those programs in effect now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. In fact, they have been for a number of years, and they just were changed again in 1990. But I think the deduction is up to $15,000 a year, and the credit is, I believe, $10,250, something like that. So it's a good deduction. I mean, if you need a deduction for your taxes, but it doesn't provide you with cash in your hand to do the work.
The other thing I'd throw into this is that if the numbers are as high as Congress said, a business person is looking at a fifth of their business being people with disabilities, theoretically. And if that's the case, then you'd think that accessibility would be money in the pocket.
Mm-hmm. Well, we consider it's a 1% additional cost and 20% of your customers would apply. That makes a lot of sense.
And I'd add to that, Jim, that actually they're missing out on 20% of the business. That's what it boils down to. So, when you open your doors to everyone, you do better business. I mean, you do more business. You also, when you provide reasonable accommodation on the job, you provide employment for people with disabilities. And the current statistics say that 2/3 of people with disabilities are unemployed. And one of the things that Congress specifically recognized in the Act was that billions of dollars in tax dollars in the U.S. are wasted every year because of non-productivity and dependency that is a part of having a disability and not being able to get into employment because of these architectural and communication barriers and those kinds of things. So there's going to be a real net gain to society as a whole, even though there's going to be some initial cost up front. The cost will be small, and it'll be incremental, and overall, we're all going to benefit from this.
Another question for you, Mike. Apparently there's a section of the ADA that covers the activities of state and local government, and we're just wondering if these weren't already covered by another law.
There, Jim made reference to Section 504, and that's the only other law that there is, the only other federal law that kind of deals with these specific issues, and that one only dealt with agencies that receive federal financial assistance, or that a contractor perhaps that contracted with the federal government, and so that was the only protection prior to ADA. A lot of states have state laws, but our state laws, we have some coverage under our state law as well. But it never did cover any kind of entity that just got like say city, county, or state funding. So for instance, the court system wasn't covered, and those kinds of things. So now what ADA has done is just extended that coverage to the rest of the public sector that does not get federal funding. It extended the coverage of 504.
And so what are the provisions of the title that covers state and local governments?
Well, there's a bunch. You know some of them, huh, Jim? Yeah.
None come to mind, actually, although I was going to mention that, interestingly enough, tribal governments aren't covered by ADA. They're exempt.
Right. They were exempted from the law, but those that receive federal funding are covered.
Through 504.
Through 504, right, exactly. So,
take the feds' money, you got to
gotta
go to
toe
the
line.
feds, rules.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. The major provisions in Title II are the same as those that are available in 504. They use a little bit different standard for existing buildings. So state and local government has to provide what's called program accessibility. What that means is you don't have to go through a building and tear it up and remodel the whole thing and make the whole thing accessible. But the program, when it's viewed in its entirety, needs to be accessible to people in existing buildings. So, for instance, if you went to college and the classroom was not accessible where you had to go to class, rather than make that classroom accessible, they could move the class to an accessible classroom. And Jim can testify that that's done all the time in campuses, all across the country. So that's a much lesser standard. They're also required to provide what are called auxiliary aids, like tape text for visually impaired people, readers, note takers, communications devices if that's necessary, those kinds of things. And then they also come under the new construction and alteration provisions, where new construction has to be built to be accessible, and alterations do as well. They're also covered under the employment provisions, which essentially mirror the Title I employment provisions. And again, the last kind of stopgap is that there's a limitation for undue hardship. So even the government's not expected to go broke. So.
Is there a deadline for the state or local governments complying with ADA?
Yeah, and it just passed Super Bowl Sunday. That was January 26th. That was kind of the big date for ADA.
It's time for them all to get organized.
Mm-hmm.
I guess public transportation is covered under this title, and if so, what are the main points to remember about transportation?
It essentially covers public transportation, and Jim's kind of has dealt with this issue with 504 as well, and that was partially covered under 504. It covers fixed route, what's called fixed route bus service, where the regular bus line needs to be accessible, meaning that there need to be lifts on the buses. And so within 30 days after the law was signed, every new bus that was purchased needed to have a lift and tie-downs for wheelchair users. Also those that were reconditioned, those needed to come back with lifts as well. And they needed to provide a comparable paratransit system. Sometimes, I think in Missoula we call it special transit, and that is the kind of the door-to-door service that people who are unable to use the fixed route system have available to them. And it also covers public rail systems like Amtrak and commuter rail and lots of things we don't have in Montana.
How about private transportation companies like cab companies or?
Yeah, those are covered too, but they have some different provisions. There are some specific provisions regarding accessibility and who has to buy lifts and who doesn't. Over-the-road buses like Greyhound are covered as well, although they have a longer period to comply, and they have to complete a technical study before they decide on whether they need to be all equipped with lifts or not. And taxis would be covered, except for they don't have any accessibility provisions, so they're covered under the general non-discrimination sections, which, you know, you can't refuse to give someone a ride or something along those lines, but that they're not required to be like lift equipped or anything like that.
Amtrak is exempt too. As I understand, I hear the story goes that it was looking pretty sad for ADA when it was a bill, and the advocates who were pushing it were trying to figure out what they could give the opposition. And they sat around and asked one another, well, do you ride Amtrak? Do you ride the rails? And nobody there did, so that's what they ended up sacrificing. So it's not covered.
Actually, though, it is.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
Oh,
in the
okay.
final wash, Amtrak got covered, but they have a long time. They, I think some of their key stations have like 30 years or something
30
like
years.
that to be coming. So I think that's what they just gave them lots of time instead of saying that they weren't covered, but they did end up covering them. So.
They're the ones who have the longest. Right.
Yeah, right. But they are covered in that, I think they have what's called the one car per train rule, where one car needs to be accessible and the dining car needs to be adjacent to it, and those kinds of things. But those things just don't concern us a lot in Montana since they left the States.
Not in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, right.
Now, how about telecommunications? Do you feel comfortable talking about that, Jim? Are you aware of the ramifications of that section of the Act?
One part of it, actually, Montana, I think, was a step ahead of the game because fairly recently the Montana legislature passed a bill that put a small tax on each telephone user's bill that is specifically designed for disability usage. I believe that the ADA requires that each state set up what's called a relay system for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, who they can call, using a TDD, call a hearing operator who can then verbalize the conversation to a hearing recipient, or vice versa. And that's available in Montana now. And there may be more.
Mm-hmm.
That's the biggie of that part. Yeah, that's kind of the main thrust of that.
Closed captions pretty pervasive in Montana now for television programs?
Not too much, and it's not the only place where that's addressed in the ADA is in terms of public service announcements, where they're required to be captioned. There may be a good argument for having, for instance, training videos for a corporation captioned for people. But there's some legislation that's in the works that's going to deal more with closed captioning. And there's another piece of legislation that did pass that required all new television sets, I believe 13 inches and over, to have the closed caption decoders built in. So, yeah.
Any idea when that might go into effect?
Which?
The decoders and the television sets and.
Generally, that part, actually, that's covered under Title. The closed captioning, I believe, is covered under Title. I'm not sure. Title III, I believe. And if that's the case, it would have gone into effect January 26th. But again, I'm not certain of that part of the law. But the relay system was required by 1993, but we've already got that in Montana anyway.
It seems like we're going to be seeing a lot of changes in the next few years.
Oh, yeah.
It's begun to happen, hasn't it?
We sure hope so, don't we, Jim?
Oh, boy.
Are there any local groups that can help businesses or other people who might be covered by the ADA with questions or concerns about what they must do to comply with the law?
Summit Independent Living Center, of course, the organization that Michael works for, can answer questions from a consumer perspective. And I would really like to see, and Michael and I have talked about this before too, we really like to see contractors, architects, and designers get up to pace with this thing. Be able to, to make contact with professionals who really understand design, because a lot of this is design. Like I was reading an article out of an architect's magazine. I don't recall the name of the magazine, but the person who was writing the article was complaining about having to be on his knees while calling on the telephone in the airport in Chicago, because the telephones were all set to wheelchair height, and he was talking about how that was a negative thing. But that's that negative part of that is a function of design. Telephones can be designed with longer cords, or maybe some kind of a sliding system or something that would allow users to use it from multiple heights.
You put the buttons in the handset?
Yeah, that would be a simple way of doing it. So I think that design is very critical. And again, I think that it doesn't have to look institutional. It doesn't have to be something that reminds us of anything, but it's just something that'll be part of the status quo.
More user-friendly, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this act goes far enough in terms of protecting against discrimination?
I think Jim and I, both having disabilities ourselves, would probably like to see it go further. But I think overall, it's a very well balanced law, and what it does is it essentially protects the rights of people with disabilities from unnecessary discrimination, but it also protects businesses and governmental entities from having to go broke in the process. So it really is, it's a very middle of the road kind of approach, and it just essentially says, we finally got to deal with this. There's no choice any longer, and we have to start making society acceptable to everyone. And the other thing is, if it hadn't been like that, it wouldn't have been really politically palatable enough to get through the Congress. So, so I think we're just real happy that we have it in the first place. And if there are any refinements that come in the future, we'll welcome those as well.
How about for people who don't have disabilities? Are there any spin-off benefits for them?
Well, I think just the the intellect that's going to be tapped, the business consumption that will come from us once we can use the mainstream facilities out there. There's a lot that comes to. I think it's also it's the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do, and I think ADA is a confirmation of that basic American spirit that says that everybody should have an opportunity. And it feels good to have that finally after years of never having it. And another thing, too, that I think is really important to understand is that ADA really is a landmark. And what it represents is a shift from saying that caregivers of the individual American citizen dumping the responsibility for paying attention to disability issues to professional caregivers, to put people with disabilities in institutions with and without walls. And what this says is that now, you can't pawn off that responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility, and we have to to approach life with an open mind. And this is confirmation of that.
And I would just add to that ADA is just it's going to be a benefit for everyone. It's going to certainly benefit people with disabilities. It's going to benefit society as a whole in terms of decreasing that loss of productivity and that unnecessary dependency. It's going to benefit, just in architectural terms, it'll benefit mothers with strollers, and it'll benefit elderly people and people of small stature and children, and really anyone with any kind of limitation that they may or may not recognize as a disability. So I guess the bottom line that we need to remember is that ADA is a win-win situation. I mean, everybody benefits from it.
Thank you both very much for being here. Jim, Mike, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. We want to thank MCAT, too, for letting us use the studio today. Thank you all for tuning in.